Hey, welcome to the Works in Progress podcast. We're here with Stian Westlake, author of Capitalism Without Capital and Restarting the Future. He's chair of the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council. Stian, explain what intangible capital is and what we should think differently about the economy if we believe that it's important.
The story about the intangible economy or intangible capital is that capital, the stuff that we invest in, businesses, governments spend money on something and it delivers a return over a period of time. Once upon a time, most capital was physical capital that you could touch or feel, machines, vehicles, buildings. And over the last 40, 50 years, that has been gradually changing so that more and more of the capital that we invest in is stuff that you can't feel or touch. It's R&D, it's software, it's data, it's organizational development, things like supply chains. It's even things like brands and artistic originals. So the Harry Potter universe is a great example of a valuable intangible asset created in the UK. That's pretty incontrovertible from the data. There's been sort of now decades of measuring this and showing how basically the intangible capital line in all rich countries has been going up for a really long time. And the tangible capital line as a percentage of GDP been going slightly down. So that's the kind of core factual observation. The claim that I would make and that others who work in this area would make is that changes in some ways how the economy works because intangible capital is kind of different from tangible capital in a few ways. Firstly, it's scalable. So something like a software application or a data set can be used across an arbitrarily large business in a way that your machines, you produce a certain number of goods, you need a new machine to produce more. And as you can imagine, that leads to huge benefits. You're going to get larger businesses. There's going to be a natural tendency for businesses to be large. So people get very worried about some large businesses. And this is kind of an argument to say, well, to some extent, you should expect this in an intangible dominated economy. The second thing is that these intangible assets tend to have spillovers. So if you invest in something, if a business invests in some R&D or the design of a new product, it's very hard for them to keep all the benefits of that product to themselves or that development, that idea. It's easy to copy. And that leads you to the kind of classic Ken Arrow description of why you need to publicly subsidize things like R&D. So that basically you get a situation where the type of capital that you need for the economy to grow will be underprovided if you just leave it to firms to provide it. So there's a benefit to kind of public co-investment. There's also the idea that these assets are particularly valuable when you combine them together. They have synergies. And one of the things that means is that what economists call agglomeration, the benefits of cities, the benefits of thriving dynamic cities, clusters, places where people can come together and bring their ideas together. Or, they could be online places, but so far this stuff seems to work better face-to-face. Agglomeration is going to become more and more important. And then the final kind of way that these intangible assets differ is they're often a sunk cost. So if a business owns some brands, if it owns some valuable software, it's often very hard for that to be taken, for creditors to take a charge on that, for that to be passed on to another business. And that creates a really big problem from a financial point of view, because most the modal business finance in the UK or in other rich countries is debt finance. It's a bank loan. And what banks really like is collateral. Once upon a time, the classic business had a bunch of tangible assets that you could take as collateral. And so the banking system worked quite well. Debt is a really simple form of finance. It's really easy to understand. Increasingly, businesses have less and less useful collateral, and that creates a challenge if you've got a debt-based finance. And it's why, for example, we've seen the kind of rise of venture capital over the last 40, 50 years, because venture capital it's obviously equity-based finance. It's the ideal type of finance for an extremely fast-growing, intangible-based company. It's really a kind of a sign, a harbinger of the intangible economy. So I haven't got around to your question about what would you change, but let me
because you are hitting on my pet theory of the housing and cities problem that the world has, right? Because the big counter argument to the claim that I make and that Ben makes that housing shortages are like the reason that most Western economies are not growing very quickly or not growing as quickly as they could. Or not very quickly. I don't even really need to hedge that. is that we're not building enough houses, specifically in prosperous cities. And the counter-argument is, well, this all seemed to set in around 2008 when the financial crisis happened. Like, that's a weird coincidence that, like, we just started building too few houses when there was this huge financial crisis and just never recovered from that, just at the time that you're saying we stopped building enough houses. And I think that what you're talking about might help to explain that. It could be that we're just wrong. I'm not discounting that.
Sure.
But if we're right, because there are loads of other arguments to say that we're right, then one reason might be that the rise of the intangible economy coincides with not 2008 specifically, but the 2000s and the 2010s and the 2020s. Because it's not just, you were saying that synergies are like the reason that cities matter, but what you're describing, the scalability point, another way of saying that is you don't need that much like land and physical capital for a given size, right? So usually if you're building like a car company or if you're building a manufacturing company, land and space are really valuable, and you need to spread out across some area of land. You can't have a successful Volkswagen unit in the center of London or in the center of Berlin. You need to build it outside somewhere. An economy built on tangible capital or manufacturing kind of needs to be spread out. And you can see just observationally, countries in Europe that have more manufacturing intensive economies like Germany are more spread out. They're not centered on a single city.
Absolutely. You've got these huge companies in these pretty small towns.
The point about spillovers, now spillovers don't have to be local spillovers, but they often are local spillovers. Like if you think about, and maybe you can talk about like how spillovers happen, like what actually is going on when there's a spillover. And obviously it can just be, I'm looking at the app that somebody has made in Shanghai and copying it. But often a spillover can be, well, we've poached a person who works for this company, right? Or
completely.
Or like,
so you want big pools of labor so that people can easily change jobs. Exactly. And often, so the classic spillover is basically a kind of, I don't know, low-key theft or not. It's uncompensated. Theft's too strong a word, sorry. But
I'm happy with theft. I'm an IP. I've become a total born-again IP maximalist, so I'm happy with theft.
So, but the classic spillover is kind of an uncompensated one. But as you say, these things can often be, they can be perfectly well compensated. You can work with someone. You can say, we will pay you a bit for that. You might not be happy with it. You might hire someone's employee. These things can happen in a whole number of ways. I guess what we know is that in theory they can happen across an unlimited amount of distance because we have telecommunications and we have Zoom and we have all these wonderful things. But I guess intuitively most of us have a feeling that they don't work as well from that point of view, and that there is something about face-to-face communication, there's something about sort of serendipitous interaction that, at least for the time being, still seems to make those transfers of information or trusted transfers of information easier to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have all my best ideas when I meet somebody for a coffee or meet somebody in the pub and I'm chatting with them. They work in a different sector and they say something and I'm like, oh, what about da-da-da-da-da-da? And then it's like, oh, right, that's really interesting. I never thought about that. But, it turns out this thing that I know that I thought was like irrelevant, redundant knowledge applied to the problem that you've got with knowledge I didn't have before. Like maybe there's a solution there. Like that's effectively a benign spillover.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
And the reason this is so cool to me or interesting to me is that if this model is right, then this kind of is the key that explains the timing of what I call the housing theory of everything, or what the housing shortages being really important. And the 2008 timing is actually a coincidence, and actually that's like, okay, it's a big coincidence, and I'm not discounting it, and I'm not trying to dismiss this point because it's an important point, and there are actually other factors that do relate to that we won't go into here. But it's possible that the rise of the intangible economy, or sounds to me like the rise of the intangible economy, is the like demand side part of the puzzle, where we always talk about the supply side part of the puzzle. There's not enough supply. What we don't talk about is why there is so much more demand to live in London now than there was to live in London 50 years ago or 40 years ago.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. And I mean, there's an interesting, if we can get historical for a second, if you look at some of the kind of the earliest anti-city critiques, or I mean, what to me are the earliest, so maybe I'm out of date here, but think of people like Thomas Jefferson who were very down on cities. There's a kind of interesting story of the evolution of the technologies of production changing people's views of cities. So Thomas Jefferson's story about cities were the countryside was where virtuous work was done. It was where agriculture was done, and that was what really created wealth. He was thinking about he had this model based on, I guess, ancient Rome, where agriculture created wealth, which in ancient Rome probably that was broadly true.
Most people have basically have that mind and that vision in their mind. They just add raw materials
They
and
just add
manufacturing
raw
to
materials.
it. Most people basically think that.
But if you're in like 1780 or whatever, and when he looked to cities, he was like, well, what happens in cities? People suck up to the king or whoever, and the king gives them stuff. And it's not stuff the king's created, it's stuff the king has taken it from someone and he gives it to these kind of terrible mosquito-like courtiers who flock around. So the model of the city, in the kind of pre-modern model of the city, is basically this extractive institution. It exists to confiscate the surplus and to give it to people who practice stuff that's basically destructive, rent-seeking activity. I mean, it's like
a parasite. It's like a parasite.
They're like parasites. It's like the days when people were granted the monopoly on something by Elizabeth I, just because they were kind of a friend or whatever.
Yeah.
And so people like Thomas Jefferson were like, cities are basically bad and they're full of disease and all this kind of thing. And actually, in a pre-modern world, it's not entirely wrong. I mean, cities did do more than that, and he was probably wrong in 1780, but it wouldn't have been hugely out for kind of a really, a medieval city or a Babylonian city. And I guess what, that line of thinking probably leads into kind of Ebenezer Howard and his sort of skepticism of cities, all the kind of William Morris type philosophy that probably informed the UK's restrictive planning laws, and perhaps
Henry George, who intended land value taxes
completely
to basically destroy cities.
Yeah, there's a sort of sense in which there is method to the madness. In that, if your model of what's going on in the economy is this stuff if cities don't matter very much. And to come back to what you were saying before, you were kind of painting this picture of a country like Germany that has these very, very productive businesses in kind of the middle of nowhere in Wolfsburg or wherever. The biggest businesses aren't in Berlin; they're in kind of.
Apologies to our listeners in Wolfsburg, but
sorry, yeah, lovely place, very productive place as well, but not a big city. If your model of the economy is that, it's not as extreme as Thomas Jefferson's economy with the courtiers, but your production is going on in places where you can build big factories, where workers can live in sanitary conditions, like the kind of model towns, Saltaire, and places like this in the UK. And again, there's a kind of logic to that. And what we're basically saying is that logic of production, the underlying dynamic, has changed. And because that's, unfortunately, we're reliant on a set of laws, certainly in the UK, in the US, and in probably a lot of other Anglo-Saxon countries at least, that were based on a kind of an old-fashioned model of how production works.
So going to what would you think differently about the economy? I have a suggestion, which is lots of people think that tech companies, very large, tech, what most people think of as tech monopolies, like your Googles or your Facebooks, your Metas, that one of the big advantages they have is that switching costs are high. Mm-hmm. So, you invest in Google and it's really difficult to switch away. So you're kind of stuck with them. Yep. And so new entrants don't have a way of getting in. And, basically the market is monopolized by virtue of that. Now, I think that's probably the case to some extent. I don't think those companies are actually monopolies in an important sense, but we don't need to get into that. But what I think people don't really understand is that in a world where we have infinitely scalable software, mm-hmm. where in principle every single person on the planet could use Instagram or could use, from a software point of view, they could all use Google Docs, let's say. Switching costs being zero, if we imagined a world where it was completely free to switch, would lead to, if everybody had the same tastes at least, would lead to everybody using the same piece of software. Yeah. Everybody, and they might switch overnight. Like if a better Google Docs came mm-hmm. along, they might then all switch, they would all switch at the same time to this sort of superior, like Alta Vista Docs or whatever the new thing was. But people conclude from the size of these platforms that they are monopolistic and that they are essentially that they have extreme market dominance. When we would expect to see in a much more competitive market, we would expect to see much larger and much more dominant platforms. So people, and so to be clear, I'm not saying that we can conclude from the fact that they're big that the market is competitive. That's a different question for a different day. There are other things we can look at. But I think because people don't think about scale and they don't think about what it looks like when it's free, essentially, to provide your product to another customer, they don't think about what that implies for the kind of natural or efficient size of companies in that marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's really right. So I think, you're absolutely right that the efficient size of a company, and when your capital is scalable, is going to be really large. I think the other thing is that, although scalability allows large companies, it also allows new companies, attackers, to very quickly take over that market. So I guess what you'd see, the classic paradigm of a competitive market in the kind of the old economy is, you've got a certain number of competitors. You've got at least 8 competitors, or at least 4 competitors, or that's what it looks like. I think in a kind of more intangible dominated sector, what you'd actually see is punctuated equilibria, where one company has an absolutely vast market share for some number of years, and then it collapses like a pile of sand, and then Google takes over from Yahoo, or whatever takes over from Google.
OpenAI takes over from Google.
Now, I realise that if you're a kind of hardcore person who thinks competition is a big problem, if you're a kind of neo-Brandeisian economist looking at this, you'll be like, well, how can I trust you that that's the current monopolists are going to be replaced by the next generation? And I admit that's a challenge. You can't predict the future, but it does feel that to some extent does describe what's happened in quite a lot of tech sectors up until now. And if it suddenly stopped happening, if there was total lock-in on the existing platforms, then I guess I'd start to doubt. But it doesn't. The punctuated equilibrium does seem to describe what's going on.
Yeah, I think the key point to me is inferring from the size of a platform that it is monopolistic is basically getting it the wrong way around.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
it just doesn't give you a strong signal.
Yeah.
It could be big because it frustrates competition, or because there are features of the market that make it difficult to compete.
Sure.
So basically, like active anti-competitive behavior, or just like sort of passive market features. Or it could be big because that's what consumers choose. And in a world where you can provide your product to anybody in the planet, consumers just get what they want, and they all herd around the thing that they want most, right?
Yeah.
So do you think there's a tension? So Ben and I both wrote this essay along with our colleague Samuel called Foundations. And I think you would hopefully share a lot of our diagnosis around housing and infrastructure, because we're talking about cities, like we're talking about people and the ability to move and work with each other.
Sure.
Place matters on the intensive margin, but less so on the extensive margin. It's the kind of intangible capital world. But energy is the other thing that we point to, and where we say that energy is incredibly important, that you cannot understand British or European sclerosis relative to the US, without looking at the rise in energy prices in Britain and Europe relative to the United States. Mm-hmm. But energy is much less important to the intangible economy, and I gather, maybe there are exceptions, maybe AI is an exception. Yeah. But for the most part, energy is not that important. Do you think that we're basically wrong, or do you think that there's have we over-indexed on basically a fundamentally kind of dying part of the economy, or is it that it's important but it's just residual?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I genuinely don't know the answer. I think you're right to highlight AI as a possible exception, because it might well be that the nature of AI is that there is a huge benefit to actually being able to domestically run huge AI-based data centers. And if that's the case, you kind of have we've identified a kind of surprising type of intangible capital that requires lots of energy. So let's park that and just say, like, setting AI aside, what do we think more broadly? I guess I definitely agree with you that high energy costs are a problem. High energy costs seem to be a problem for manufacturing sectors. They're certainly a problem for what sometimes get called foundational manufacturing sectors, like basic materials, and so forth. I guess the interesting question is, do you actually, if you didn't have that, let's suppose you had to have an economy that was largely based on services that weren't particularly energy intensive, because your electricity in your country was super expensive, so you were buying that stuff in from elsewhere. Could that work? I guess my view is that could work. It feels to me that you can have a kind of, you can manufacture goods are tradable. You could basically trade in low value manufactured goods, produce high value manufactured goods where energy is a lower proportion of the costs, and have that work well. I guess where I agree with you, regardless of that, is that probably isn't where the UK is starting from now. the UK, for all that we meme ourselves into thinking this isn't true, the UK actually does have a pretty sizable manufacturing sector, almost the same size as France's. We're not as big as Germany, but Germany is really, really weird. Germany has a huge manufacturing sector relative to other rich countries. So manufacturing does matter in the UK, and certainly for a lot of manufacturing, it seems that energy costs are a problem. I guess the other question that is I don't feel I have an answer to. Some people have got very strong views on it. Is there some kind of synergy between these so-called foundational, extremely energy-intensive bits of the manufacturing economy and very high-value ones where energy is a smaller part of the market, which is certainly something people hear. I mean, the whole concept of foundational industries is sort of, that's what it's meant to imply. It's meant to imply you need that if you want the other areas. And it seems like, perhaps it's plausible, perhaps there's some transferable skills between the two, and therefore that there is ironically some intangibles that are created by having a huge glass making industry or something that then flow into more advanced manufacturing. But I guess what I'm saying is, in theory, if the UK was a totally post-industrial economy, then I might say energy costs might not matter very much because you could just do without them. The fact is that's not where the UK is, so energy costs probably do matter.
What about manufacturing, like innovative manufacturing companies? Like energy, and I actually don't know about this, how important energy costs are to like startup innovators that do physical stuff.
Yeah.
Like there is obviously a ton of innovation that could happen in the physical world that is basically the intersection of the intangible economy and the tangible economy.
Yeah.
Like not all it, like there's a ton of ideas that require the application of the idea to the physical world. And I don't actually have a good sense of how important energy costs are as a constraint on what they can do.
No, neither do I. I mean, if I had to guess, I would think that if there is a transmission mechanism from high energy costs to underperforming advanced manufacturing, it's not so much that the energy costs directly affect them, but it's that they undermine, sorry, I'm going to get a bit heterodox here, but they undermine a kind of industrial commons that they depend on. So certainly,
what are the industrial commons?
This is again, this is a bit of an intangible idea, but the idea that, well, to take an example of where there is something that's arguably an industrial commons, if you look at sort of some of the big manufacturing clusters in China, the story that I hear told about them is there's just a huge amount of general manufacturing skill that goes around. In the same way that in the UK there's a lot of skill in the creative industries that is totally tacit, that is just sort of generated by lots of people working on things in an area. It's the kind of classic Alfred Marshall clusters theory from the early 20th century. If that's true, it basically suggests that having a lot of manufacturing output is synergistic with the next incremental bit of manufacturing output because the skills are there. Certainly, if you talk to the people at the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge, they're very big on this. They kind of will give you lots of qualitative evidence. I've not seen much quantitative evidence, and I accept that some people will be sceptical of this because they'll say, surely this is just a kind of manufacturing just so story. On the other hand, we know clusters exist. We know that kind of knowledge does get transmitted tacitly, so that you'd effectively get this kind of transmission from high energy costs, smaller manufacturing sector because you're driving out the lower value added stuff, and that effectively, because there are synergies between the two, meaning that it's harder to get the skills to do. It's speculative.
Yeah. I have a couple of questions on the bit like jumping into a new area, but it draws on everything we've been talking about. So if you ran a developing country, would your view be that if you ran a developing country and you're also Stian Westlake, so you have your background and the reason they picked you to run the country is because of the knowledge, the things you know about, would you advise them to do like try and jump right to high-tech stuff? Would you build like an ITRI if you were Taiwan in the 1950s? Would you be trying to jump right, like if you're India right now, do you want to build a massive space organization, or are you trying to do the most high-tech chip manufacturing? Or would your view be like the Chinese clusters you were talking about? Would your view be like get the basic stuff and then steadily, incrementally get better at technology?
That's such an interesting question. So I've definitely not putting myself forward for this role because I don't know. But I guess on the one hand, there is a real, if you can make the leap, then you avoid a lot of potential development traps. We know kind of these middle income traps that countries can get caught in if they try and take the sort of standard path, not least because China will outproduce them in various areas if they try and go from agriculture to manufacturing into services. I've often heard people involved in kind of economic development in Ireland tell the story that Ireland kind of went straight from a pre-manufacturing or pre-industrial to a post-industrial state. And, it looks to me like the work that they did in terms of developing call centres, attracting foreign direct investment, acting as a kind of corporate local headquarters base, that seemed to work. I mean, it seems to have made Ireland very prosperous.
So I'm interested in that, but what I'm really thinking about is more not the economic stages of like tertiary employment but the level of tech. I
see what you mean.
So, for example, Britain in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s went very heavy into let's make the best train in the world.
Sure.
Let's make the best nuclear power station in the world. Let's make the best plane in the world. And like to some extent, they to lesser or greater degrees, they somewhat succeeded in actually generating the advanced passenger train, but then not actually doing it. And then building the advanced gas reactors, which by modern standards probably look quite good, but certainly by their standards looked really bad. Concorde, etc. Should they be trying things like that?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think what at the core of that is the idea that you can be too innovative. You can overinvest in R&D relative to other things that you might want to invest in. My gut feeling, especially when you frame it that way, is that's probably a mistake. Now the question comes: what's the right balance to strike between old stuff and new stuff? But I mean, the being at the technological frontier feels almost like an unnecessary place for a developing country to be, because you don't need to be. You can just kind of copy things that work, and ideally you can kind of do it in a way that avoids some of the path-dependent mistakes that other countries might have made.
I want to talk about scaling where it seems to fail in the intangible economy, which is food and restaurants.
Yes.
When restaurants try to become chains, they almost always fail, in my experience, in my observed experience. Either they fail, they almost always fail economically. They basically always fail. There's like one exception that I'm aware of, which is Honest Burger. They basically always fail in terms of like the quality of what they're doing, when what they're doing is entirely intangible, right? Like it's essentially recipes and a business model. There's like a certain tangibility, which is like you need a restaurant and you need a chef and you need and so on. But like the thing you are transferring between essentially homogenous kitchens is ideas. And why is it that scaling, I think, completely fails when restaurants try to chain? Almost always fails. If it seems to work in other areas. Like, what's the thing that makes restaurants or food different?
It's really interesting. I wonder if there's kind of two things going on here. So I think there is something which is pretty much like what you described, that it is just hard to transmit the knowledge of how to cook something in a particular way between different artisanal people cooking in different restaurants. It's difficult to codify. It's difficult to make that very, very precise. And I mean, that seems to be empirically true, that when these chains expand very fast, they're perhaps dependent on extremely high skilled, motivated people in their kind of original location, and that just recruiting at that scale is hard to do. I mean, if you're McDonald's and you've got an extremely well specified process and, significant physical capital to kind of automate the process, you can get away with it. Certainly for me, a McDonald's burger
McDonald's is a
McDonald's
very,
is
very
genuinely
noble
very
exception.
scalable.
One of the most
works really
successful. Well. I mean, clearly the most successful scaled restaurant in the world, no question.
Exactly, and has incredibly consistent quality, and that's kind of part of the idea. And I guess partly that is because a lot of you've worked in a McDonald's, I haven't, but a lot of this is kind of that that it's dependent on physical capital. There's a lot of capital in a McDonald's kitchen that allows things to be replicated, because physical capital you can mass produce in a way that you can't mass produce cooks. So that probably helps. Making the offer relatively simple probably helps as well. So I think there is just something that if you scale a business based on hiring more people and trying to get them to replicate a process, it's hard. So, when I think about my early days working in management consulting, that was a service-based business McKinsey was a service-based business that basically replicated a process flow, a pretty straightforward, pretty standard flow of recruiting people and of doing projects across, I don't know how many countries, dozens of countries. But the amount of investment that went into building the culture, into ensuring the right kind of hiring practices was, people sometimes disparagingly call it cult-like, but I don't doubt for a moment that level of culture control and conscious generation of culture was necessary to do that. Now, if you're Byron Burger, you're not making those kind of investments. You're not sending your new burger chef on a kind of intense off-site day and selecting them individually through 5 rounds of interviews. It's just a different process. So I think there is one thing that just scaling at a lower end of offering where you're reliant on kind of artisanal processes is harder.
I was just wondering if anyone had ever been to Cheesecake Factory, because I gather they have a really long menu and it's really consistent and really good.
It's gone downhill, unfortunately.
Oh damn! So they followed the same.
It was
rule.
incredible.
I wasn't a
10 years
fan,
ago.
but
I think it was amazing 10 years ago, but I think it's gone downhill.
I wanted to also add another example, which is that coffee. You might think that coffee, right? So like especially espresso, the same core bit is going into all of the drinks, and yet in the article Nick Whitaker wrote for us, our ex-colleague, he points out that they basically never managed to scale either machines because there are so many difficult moving parts, or maybe they're getting to that now, or coffee shops. Even coffee shop chains don't generally manage to scale that well because there are certain things like dialing in the burrs, as he says, one of the things that you just need to have process knowledge. Is really hard to get it without A, learning by doing, B, apprenticing to someone who's really good. And so it's really difficult to scale even like high-end third wave coffee shops.
Yeah,
so that's
a great example. I guess the other dimension, so to take a totally different tack on your question, you sort of started with the premise that chain restaurants fail. And empirically they fail in the sense that, they're very popular and then they become bad and then they close down. So, that is a certain sense of failure. I guess there's an interesting question of saying, is that really failure? And I guess what I mean by that is, if you think of the brand or the brand and the menu and the offering of a restaurant as basically a bit of intangible capital, it's kind of it's the business idea. I mean, what we know about a lot of creative industries, and I would consider restaurant food to be sort of affiliated to that, is that tastes change, to be really kind of simplistic about it. And in a way, you could see that as being capital that depreciates. So if you come up with, say, I don't know, Byron Burger is a great example, a particular set of offerings around a kind of relatively high quality burger in a sort of fast food setting. It may just be that extending that brand forever, that the brand has a shelf life in the same way that if you buy a computer, if a firm buys a computer, it'll depreciate that computer over a period of time, and that the end of life of that computer makes sense. So if you look at the kind of what do we call it, like the fast casual food sector?
Fast casual, yeah.
If you talk about the fast casual food sector as basically a set of people who will, they'll create brands, or rather they will go and find individual restaurants and say, this has the potential to be a brand. They'll take that brand, they'll scale it to the best of their ability, but given, with the limits that you can't invest unlimitedly in the human capital to get the baristas making the perfect coffee or cooking the perfect burger, but you do the best you can so it scales acceptably for a period of time. But, that brand will only have maybe a 7-year life. And I guess when we look at firms that don't work like that, you look at McDonald's, you look at Pizza Express, that maybe they're sort of weird exceptions that we shouldn't be judging the things by. Maybe actually a healthy industry looks like, Byron Burger is big for 5 years and, I don't know, Oaxaca is big for 5 years, and then they go to seed.
Well, do the investors who do that make money on the long run? I mean, if they do, then that sounds correct. If they end up becoming poorer because of what they've done, then that sounds like that isn't the case.
It's a good question. I mean, I assume... You'd hope they are. I mean, you need to get Luke Johnson on and ask him, but I assume these people do make money out of it because they keep on coming back. I think it's probably different if you're looking at the high-end one-off restaurant business. I get the feeling that a lot of people open a restaurant and it's kind of a consumption good. That's a different story. But I'm assuming that, if you take a fast casual chain that operates for a decent number of years, quite a lot of people have made a lot of money out of it.
Here's a question I have for you. So a thing I think about a lot is how within government, when we try and solve a new problem, you take the existing structures and the existing organizational structures and existing teams, say, okay, let's take these guys, let's go and solve the new problem. So anything new that happens, if it's the Home Office's area, the Home Office solves it. In business, generally what happens is IBM tries to solve the problem of like personal computers in the 2000s, and then someone else starts a company which, and then in fact that solves the problem.
Yeah.
And so we all just shift across. Now, I'm wondering, does intangible capital mean that we do more of that like extremely rapid shifting from one thing to another? And is the world of intangible capital made us therefore less, like, are government structures becoming more sclerotic because of their inability to like create new organizations?
Yeah.
Like because we don't have, you're saying that intangible capital is like a recipe for doing something.
Yeah. We
always have to use the same recipe and try and update it a little bit rather than having completely new recipes. Is this a bigger problem now than it was 50 years ago?
So I don't know if this is exactly the same as you're asking, but I do think that the rise of the importance of intangible capital puts a real burden on government to generate new institutions, new effective institutions. So case in point, when we're looking at intellectual property rights, which you briefly mentioned earlier, intellectual property rights are really tricky to work out. Like, no one has a particularly good intuitive moral feel about who should own stuff. That you can have people making this very passionate case that artists should have very strong rights over things they create. Equally, you can have people saying copyright is really immoral, and those people will be as morally impassioned as the artists. Our moral intuitions are quite all over the place on intellectual property rights. But we also know that intangible property rights get more and more important in an intangible economy because there are more intangible assets. You need to work out who owns them, and both the need to own those things, because if there was no intellectual property rights at all, then you would imagine that people would produce fewer of the relevant intangible assets. But at the same time, the ability to combine them, which kind of effectively relies on slightly weaker assets, because if you sort of say, classic case in point that we're seeing in the debate about copyright and AI at the moment, I think if you allowed the creative industries to entirely set the terms of the debate, you'd basically have, AI models wouldn't be allowed to train on any creative data, or only at an absolutely exorbitant price that was unilaterally decided by creatives who weren't necessarily well informed about what the market would bear. So you kind of want to combine things, and you basically need institutions to govern that in a sense. The intellectual property rights is one institution, copyright exchanges are another set of institutions, but those institutions don't exist at the moment. And you kind of say, well, okay, what's government's track record at creating new institutions? It's not great. It was probably pretty good in the 1850s. The 1850s, governments created lots of institutions and civil society created lots of institutions. We probably are less good at doing that now. So I think that kind of, that's a real challenge for government.
Okay, Stian, so you run the ESRC. We now have this organisation, ARIA, which has complete freedom to take bets on all the kinds of things that are really going to change the world. Given that we have this inspired by ARPA and DARPA that did such amazing things in the US, why would we keep your organisation going? Shouldn't we just roll it into ARIA?
It's the justify your existence question. I think when it comes to research funding, one thing that we know we need is a portfolio. A mixed portfolio of different ways of doing things. So ARIA and things like ARPA that ARIA is based on is hugely important. I think doing kind of really radical blue sky research and innovation is really important. It's a really important part of the mix. But to make that happen, you also need a bunch of other things. That's part of almost like a value chain. You need someone to fund your PhD students in the first place. You need to fund people to get their training, however they're going to do that. You need infrastructure. So we spend probably about coming up to a third of our budget on providing data infrastructures, which basically allow people to do social science. And that's the kind of thing, ARIA doesn't do that. They rely on people like us to do it. And then what's the kind of, the thing that I find kind of interesting is, as well as breakthrough research, you do also need incremental research, people to work on smaller projects, more longer term projects that are part of researchers' curiosity. And I think the system before was lacking something when we didn't have ARIA, but I think you don't want just ARIA in the same way that you don't want just funding PhDs or just funding big grants for mature researchers.
Can you tell me more about data infrastructure? What is that?
So let me give you an example. For quite a while, there's been a talking point about certain university degrees not being worth doing. And, people will say, look, we've looked at the data. If you study these particular subjects, you will have a low income, and it's suggesting that these things aren't leading to graduate jobs. Where all of that comes from is merging together two government data sets, what we call two administrative data sets created when the government does its business. One is tax data, which gives you really accurate records of what people are earning. And the other is the life course data on people's education, so where they went to school, what grades they got at school, what they studied at university. Those two data sets sit in entirely different places in government, and no one combines them. One of the things that we fund is a project called Administrative Data Research UK, which basically works with government and merges those data sets so that people can do research on them, like the research that was done to work out that, some degrees you earn a lot of money if you do them and some degrees you don't. And there's that's a good example of the kind of research that we fund. We're now looking at data infrastructures, looking at new data created by social media, data created by smart cards. And I guess what's interesting about this, if you think about the incentives on researchers got a huge incentive to get their own private data store and then max out the papers they produce from it, churn out the papers. And actually, they don't have a huge amount of incentive to let other people see that data. For us, this is infrastructure. For us, there's a huge benefit to saying, let's prepare the data and then let's make that as widely known as possible so people can do as much research as they can.
So I'm curious about this merging data sets thing, because it's a big bugbear I have for various reasons. Is this a cumulative thing? Is it like electrifying different train networks? You go through and you've joined that data set, now we can do loads of work with that joined data set? Or is it more like a one-off project thing where we have a bunch of insights and then next year it's not joined?
So it's more like the first. So once you join them, you can use them again and again, because actually most of the work in joining these data sets, it's not really technical work. It's not computer science. It's not software. It's kind of emotional labor, as they'd say. It's going to the people who are responsible for these data sets in the government and convincing them that they are not going to get in trouble, that the politician who is their boss is not going to get in trouble if you can look at one data set about crime alongside another data set about health outcomes. And it's not that, people who work for the government it's not that they want to keep these data sets secret. It's just that they're risk averse. What will happen? So once you've done that work, then you can make the data sets more widely available.
Okay, so I need to hear more about which I'd love. There are so many I'd love to join up, and with what's going to happen next on these. Because, for example, my wife, maybe I shouldn't say who, a person related to me very closely is a doctor, and she has had many, many, many different troubles in her job, from the belief that many people have that you aren't able to join up various different data sets. You're allowed to view one, type it into another, and that's fine because the doctor would be able to see both those things, and the doctor would be able to insert into both those data sets. But it's perceived that there are various issues with joining them up and having all that information to hand. And so doctors waste hours of their time creating new lists every day, et cetera, et cetera. Now, sometimes that's because they haven't invested properly in IT or whatever reason. But I think there are a lot of cases where the data isn't joined up. And then related to that, there are also things where I feel like we don't even have basic correlations, where we could easily at least start the research off by saying, okay, well, look, there's this big question now about whether illness burden is driving disability rates, disability claimant rates in universal credit, the UK's benefit system, up. And there's a huge question of, is it that the system is more exploitable after the existence of TikTok, or is it the system is more exploitable because UC is worse than the previous systems which have been heavily patched, or is it that we've got a much higher illness burden since COVID? I feel like could you answer those things?
There is so much that we can do. So I can't answer them now. We're doing actually Department for Work and Pensions, who handle the UK's claimant data. We've now just started to do a load of work with them, merging their data sets. So I hope some of these questions are going to be more answerable in the future. It's interesting just to come back to this kind of original question about, well, what's the point of, why do you have these government organisations funding research? A while ago, I came across an interesting paper that's about a decade old by Tyler Cohen and Alex Tabarrok, the economists, and it was basically about the US's economics funding, public economics funder. So it was what should the National Science Foundation fund when it comes to economics? And I'd probably been doing the job for about a year when I picked this up, and I thought, goodness me, this is basically going to tell me that everything I've been doing is wrong and I need to totally rethink. And, I think Tyler's great. So I was thinking, I'm going to feel very conflicted at this point. It's really interesting what he said he thought the US public science fund should fund when it comes to economics. He basically said data infrastructures. He said translational work. So there are lots of insights that come from economics about how you should run, for example, the housing and the planning system, something that I know you talk about a lot. A lot of that is locked away in papers. Sometimes they're in journals that policymakers can't read, but in any case, they're designed to be read by scholars, not by public policymakers. And he was sort of saying, well, look, you should fund translational work to make these things accessible. And then he also said you should fund replications. So fixing the reproducibility issue. And he was saying these are the things, these are underfunded things that public funders should focus on, because actually academics will do the other work themselves. And actually, when I look at where we now spend most of our budget, we spend, as I say, almost a third on data infrastructures. We spend about 10% on what we'd call translational work. So we fund something called the Economics Observatory, which is trying to translate some of these insights into stuff that's useful for policymakers. The one thing we don't do a lot of is replication. That's a really interesting question about how much more there is scope to do when it comes to trying to replicate some of these social science studies.
Go ahead. I would, to bolt onto that, it would be great to have a couple of there are guys. I think it was bigger in the 2010s and in the 2000s, but there were a lot of people on the internet who got their reputation from basically fisking things.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes you can get a career out of that, or you can get lots of prestige out of it. So we get enough of it. But probably in general, we do too little of it, because if you're to be that person, you have to have a very specific mindset to be willing to make everyone angry with you and so on. And there are some people who really like that, but maybe not enough of them, because there are so many incentives to like knuckle under and be part of the gang and so on. So maybe funding like a bunch of Fiskers who are constantly checking everything would be...
You should get Michael Weiber. Do you know him?
Yeah.
He just does these replications that are absolutely... I mean, they're brutal, because he does replications of studies that I like as well.
Yeah.
And they often turn out to be not as good, either just bogus or not as good as you had hoped. And, you have to update based on that. But it's a lot of work, right? And how do you overcome the fact that there's like no prestige in this, and you're actually it seems like academics look down their noses on people who do replications. Like, they say that they like replications, but if you actually do replications, it seems like not very good for your career, and you have to be like a true believer like Michael to actually be willing to do it.
I mean, there's definitely some things that are favoured in academia and some things that are disfavoured. So translational work generally disfavoured. Replications, there are some people who are into replications, but as you say, it's not the kind of it's not the classic way to get your top economics journal publication. And actually data infrastructures as well. This is part of the reason why Tyler thinks it's worth publicly funding it, because it's not the kind of thing academics are intrinsically motivated or motivated by prestige intrinsic to the economics discipline to do. So this comes back to this idea of a portfolio, because you wouldn't want everyone doing replications, because then there'd be nothing no research to replicate. But you probably would want a bit of your portfolio looking at that.
Well, look, I was at the ARIA summit this week. Right, it was very interesting, very exciting, lots of really cool work. But it did make me think, like, how can we ever, like, it's going to take us like 30 years before we can look and say whether this succeeded or not.
Yeah.
And I feel that this is true of almost all of the money that we spend on research, unless it's really, really, really useless research, right? Like, it's like there's like an inverse correlation between how soon you can measure the impact, quote unquote, of the research, and how like worthy it was to have funded in the first place. Because like really what you want is the like massive long-term bets, and like you really do want that kind of really long-term investment in smart people and ideas and research and infrastructure and so on. But it does like make you think, like, are we just potentially just throwing money into gaping maw? I don't think we are with ARIA.
Yeah.
I don't know that we are with the ESRC, but I don't know that I could like answer definitively that we're not, because like what's the counterfactual?
It's really hard to measure. I think economists have been wrestling with this for a long time. I think we'll continue to wrestle with this. We've been having some really interesting conversations with Open Philanthropy about how we might be able to analytically push the frontier on this. I guess what I would say is there are definitely some research and development bets that are really long term. Like you say, the kind of mRNA vaccine work. You start work in, I don't know, 1980, and it yields the benefits in 2020 when there's a COVID pandemic. Some of that stuff is really, really long term. And for a long time, as we know with mRNA vaccines, people thought, this is a blind alley. This is a really low status, low return field. There's definitely some of those kind of high variance bets. But when I look at the stuff that we fund, there is some stuff that generates results quite quickly. I mean, not of the scale of saving the world from a deadly pandemic, but stuff that's genuinely really useful in a more short measurable term. So project that we've been funding for a while, which goes by the name of the Decision Maker Panel, is basically an economic project to kind of work out what's going on with people who run businesses. And it's run partly in the UK, partly in Stanford. So Nick Bloom, who you may know, Stanford economist, is very involved in it. And they basically just found a better way of more rapidly surveying businesses to ask them questions about the economy. And it turned out that was really useful immediately post-pandemic, because they were the people who did all these really detailed surveys on working from home. So you might have seen the headline figures that Nick sometimes, he talks about them quite eloquently on Twitter, where they basically said that hybrid working can be as good as in-person working, but you've got to be in the office at least 3 days a week, and those 3 days have to be the same as your colleagues, which is kind of, no one really knew, and there was something that people were hugely speculating about. And Nick brought data. That was a kind of big research project that would have been pretty hard to do otherwise, would have been pretty unlikely that a business would have funded it, and the return was definitely within 5 years, probably shorter than that. So there's definitely some stuff that has a quicker return, and you see the benefits more incrementally. But I agree, there's a real challenge about how do you measure these really big long-term bets?
Well, even an even pointier version of that would be, so if I asked you, should we do more of what you do? You'd probably think, well, what we do is amazing. You should definitely do more. We're not at that point. But how will we actually know when we're at the point where we're about to spend too much, or about to spend too little? What could we do what would you actually do if I told you tomorrow, I'm Keir Starmer and I've made you have to decide exactly how much there is with a really strong argument for why it's that number? How would you try and do that?
What would be the optimal amount? So I think this is a really tough one, and part of the problem is, there's a question about how do you work out where do you hit diminishing marginal returns, but there's also a problem about, for want of a better word, what's the kind of heterogeneity of the returns to an R&D investment? So if you imagine the kind of world, the sort of magical library where you can see every R&D project that you funded, and each one is kind of in discrete little blobs, and then you can magically see what the end result value of those investments is. How close to the average are you going to be? How grouped are they going to be? Or are there basically going to be a few things that are like the mRNA vaccine that are incredible home runs that massively have a huge ROI, and others that don't? And I guess if we think about physical investments, if we think about kind of buying a fleet of vans for a business that runs a delivery business, if you pay $20,000 for a van, that van is going to be worth about $20,000. Some vans are lemons, maybe, but the clustering is going to be very tight. Partly because these are mass produced, partly because they're tradable goods. There are markets for them, so you can determine the price. That kind of capital is pretty homogeneous in its value. R&D assets, intuitively, you think they're going to be much more heterogeneous. They're going to be much more random. So I guess what that means is, if you've got a choice between optimizing on two dimensions, increasing the quantity and increasing the quality, at some point, if you genuinely think you can increase the quality, if you think that funding science in a better way will make you more likely to get those home runs, then maybe you want to focus more on optimizing the quality rather than optimizing the quantity.
I'm not going to name any institution because nobody's here to defend themselves, and I don't want to ask you to defend or criticize any institution, but I have often seen institutions that I think are putting out basically kind of politicized nonsense, let's say about housing, for example, but not limited to housing, that they have been in receipt of ESRC funds. And the same is true in lots of other countries. It's not a criticism of your organization in particular, but it seems to be the nature of, the further you veer from the hard sciences into let's say the social sciences or the humanities, the closer you get to funding people's like political, ideological hobby horses. And that's fine. Like everybody, I mean, I've got plenty, but I don't think that it's good. I don't think it's like the right way to use taxpayer money, and I think it's just bad. It creates a negative externality to fund like bad research and to fund politicized research. So like, how do you avoid that? Or like, do you avoid that? Is that just a lot of academics seem to think this is like part of the deal, that they get funded by the government to do the thing that they are, being contracted for, let's say, and then in their free time they get to write pieces about how you don't need to build any more houses because you can just redistribute people up to like the Scottish Highlands and there are plenty of houses there. Is that a problem in your mind?
So I think it is a problem, but I think I might be seeing a different problem to the one that you're seeing. So for me, the fact that researchers are going to have ideological priors, I'm actually not so bothered by just that very fact. I think there's a pretty noble tradition of people coming up with very insightful social science when they come from a very strong ideological position, and it's also pretty hard to drive those priors out of the system. What I think is a problem is if those ideological priors aren't kind of worked out in the way research comes together, in the debate between research and in the quality control mechanism that happens in academic debate or public policy debate around that academic work. And I guess where that becomes a problem is if you've got systematic bias in the researcher base. If you've got someone who has a very strong ideological bias towards the kind of position you're describing, a kind of NIMBY, redistribute people around the country position. The problem is if that represents kind of an overwhelming majority of opinion, say because of the class interests of the people who are doing the research, and that then the overall body of research is effectively skewed. And I guess the question is, how common do we think that is? There was some really interesting survey research done. I mean, John Haidt in the US did quite a lot of it, looking at the academy a few years ago. There's been some really interesting research in polling research in the UK by More in Common, in fact, looking at sort of segmenting people by ideological opinion. And that seemed to suggest, which probably won't surprise people, that in the academy there are kind of ideological biases. And I guess the question is, that probably doesn't matter that much for the majority of work. I mean, the majority of research that's done in the academy is hard sciences, life sciences, medicine. And although some of those things, your ideological priors matter, for a lot it doesn't really matter. I mean, I would argue that if all material scientists were fervent Albanian nationalists, probably wouldn't make much of a difference because the two things don't intersect very much. But as you say, if every economic geographer has some sort of particular ideological prior that's not related to their work about the egalitarian distribution of land, that probably is a problem. And that's why maybe in the social sciences, maybe in the arts and humanities, we have to worry more if the academy is systematically ideologically biased. And I guess some of John Haight's work suggested that those biases are growing over time, probably reflects slightly the kind of the different experience of working at university over that time. And I guess that for me is really, that is something that we should all be concerned about, and we should all be trying to say, well, if we want the optimally truth-seeking research landscape, then we have to pay attention to that as funders and make sure that you're getting an appropriate debate about these issues that's not just purely being driven by a particular distribution of views among the researchers you're funding.
Thanks for listening. Check out Works in Progress at worksinprogress.co.